In the name of Chthonian horrors, I will punish you in this episode of Battle Guides featuring Irialandradayamorella. Irialandradayamorella, or Erie for short, is a brawler with amazing stats and versatile capabilities. However, that all comes at the cost of needing proper form management, having awkward effects, as well as being very stat reliant. Erie's unique ability is Starlight Change. Long story short, Erie has 3 forms, and during the anti-phase, she may choose to change her form once per beat. Now, depending on whether or not she transforms, she gains varying bonuses. If she chooses to change form, she gains that form's transform effect. Otherwise, she gains her current form's stabilize effect. Now, before we get into how to use this unique ability, it's very important to understand what each of the forms do. Let's start off with Magical Girl form. And I don't care what it says, it's Magical Girl form. Its transform effect gives Erie +1 priority as well as -1 power. And its stabilize effect gives Erie range +0 to 1 as well as on hit. If your opponent is at this attack's maximum range, you gain power +1. This form is all about hit confirm. Priority and range are the things that make hitting opponents that much easier. Its transform effect can be very potent when paired with certain attacks, especially if you need the extra priority to get there, and especially if the extra power loss doesn't bother you as much. However, I do think its stabilize effect is one of the most powerful because it gives Erie hit confirm. She has a variety of range +0 to 1 styles, making this effect much more potent when paired with those styles, as it gives Erie magical range +0 to 2 onto every attack she has. This is pretty absurd and can be pretty powerful when used correctly. Of course, given that she has multiple effects that allow her to move the opponent or move herself around, she can also finagle the extra power +1 that much easier. Next up is Night form. Night form is amazing, having Stun Guard 3 and priority -2 when you transform into it, and Stun Guard 3 so long as the opponent is in this attack's range as its stabilize effect. Remember that the stabilize effect is checked when your opponent damages you. This means after all on-hit effects, but before all on-damage effects. This form is crazy. Erie doesn't really have a lot of stun guard on her styles because she absolutely does not freaking need it. Because Night form gives her magical stun guard 3 on whatever attack she wants. This is insane, offering Erie a multitude of defensive options, and basically Erie can basically not play a bad pair. Most of her pairs would at least have stun guard 3 if you anti the Knight, and with that alone I think that makes any attack pair she can play that much better. And really, her worst attacks are oftentimes the decent attacks of other people precisely because of this form. This is my favorite form on Erie, and it's quite powerful, and I'll go more into it later on. And finally, we have Cosmic form. Cosmic form turns Erie into a giant blob Chthonian horror creature, and it also gives her one of her most aggressive stats in the game. It gives her extra priority and extra power. As its transform effect, Erie gains power +2 but loses 1 life, which is very powerful when you pair it up with a lot of her styles, as not a lot of them have bonus power. However, its stabilize effect is quite powerful as well. Giving opponents at range 1 priority -3 is huge, because not only is it a really powerful effect, it's essentially a better version of priority +3, which means that Erie can utterly destroy opponents in melee range if they're not careful enough. She can put on a big offensive using her Cosmic form, and I think it's one of her most aggressive forms in her kit. Now, this unique ability is so interesting, because Erie is essentially a weird stance switcher who doesn't want to switch stances that often, and sometimes wants to switch stances very often. Most of the time, your attack pairs and your cards will change depending on what form you're in, meaning that a majority of Erie's attacks can be mutated, iterated, and changed to fit the current situation. This gives Erie a lot of versatility in dealing with her opponents. However, much more than that, in a more primal sense, these forms give Erie so much stats. Extra range, extra stun guard, and extra power/priority are all good stats, and Erie gets them in truckloads for almost no cost using her unique ability. Therefore, as Erie, you're often just gonna juggernaut your way through a lot of things. You have an opponent who is tricky, get some range. You have an opponent who's fast and deals small damage, get stun guard 3 on every attack. You have an opponent who's kinda fast, then reduce their priority by 3 every turn. Or you have an opponent who just wants to trade with you, then trade better than them by having power +2. This makes Erie very versatile, but also very powerful on her own. Such is the case with a quintessential brawler. Erie is able to take advantage of her opponent's weaknesses while pressuring them with stats that they don't have. Against slower characters, you'll levy your extra priority or extra power. Against faster characters, you'll levy your extra defenses. These all work together to make Erie a destructive force. Just watch out because she doesn't really have many tricky effects. Now let's go on to Erie's styles. First off is Galactic. Galactic has no stats and only has one reveal effect. But long story short, this reveal effect might sound complicated, but it essentially means that you get all the stats on your current form. So if you transform, you gain that form's stabilize effect, or if you don't transform, you gain your form's transform effect. This basically means that this style essentially changes depending on what form you're in. If you're in magical form, it gives you range and priority. If you're in night form, it gives you so much stun guard. And of course, if you're in cosmic form, it not only gives you priority, it also gives you bonus power to boot. This is a very powerful style and again embodies how versatile Erie can be. This is a very good style and it really changes depending on what form you're in, so the recommended attack pairs will be dependent on your form. Now, if you're in magical form, I highly recommend this with her unique base, Starlight. Starlight not only gains the bonus range from this, it also gains bonus priority, bringing its priority up to a number of 4. If your opponent is at the maximum range, you can also gain the bonus power. However, it deals absolutely no damage and it's only really useful for stunning opponents who might not have enough stun guard to deal with it. However, if you do need the extra power, you can always just sprinkle force gauge power on top. Now, if you're in night form, I highly recommend it with Shot. Synergizing the extra stun guard from night form with Shot is quite powerful. Not only that, but night stabilize effect only works if your opponent is in the range of the attack. So, by putting it with Shot, your opponent will almost always be in your attack's range, granting you that amazing stun guard like 8, if you ever need that much. And finally, if you're in cosmic form, I highly recommend it with Drive. Not only does this give Drive extra priority, making it that much more powerful, it also gives it extra power, giving you an effective attack with range 1 to 3, power 5, and priority 7. Just be sure your opponent is in melee range when you do it. Next up is Aurora. Aurora has range +1 to 2, power +1, and no priority bonuses or penalties. However, the interesting thing about it is that on hit, your opponent must discard a base of their choice with their current attack, lowering the amount of options they have the next beat. This is quite a powerful attack because Erie kinda gets predictable since she's just a stat beast. If you lower your opponent's options, you can then levy on that advantage and do bigger, more powerful payout attacks should the situation arise. Now when it comes to attack pairs, I highly recommend it with Burst if you're in night form. Not only does it synergize with both the transform and stabilize effects, giving it stun guard 3, making it a decent attack, it also has a lot of range, making sure the stabilize will almost always work. Plus, it allows you to set up for the next beat by putting you at range and letting you advance with Comet, which we'll talk about later on. However, if that's not your thing, you can also easily pair it with Grasp. Grasp benefits a lot from the extra range, and if you're in magical form, it gives it either more priority or even more range, which is quite powerful to boot. Plus, you can synergize Grasp with magical form's extra range and the on-hit effect to guarantee yourself the extra +2 power. However, it also works in cosmic style as well, but only if you transform, because the stabilize effect only works at range 1 and you won't hit opponents at range 1. Next up is Magical. Magical is range plus 0 to 1 and priority plus 1, giving you a lot of good stats for almost no cost. And its after activating effect of retreat 1 space allows Erie to dodge opponents who are melee ranged. Now, this is a very powerful style because it allows you to dodge opponents, gives you hit confirm, and gives you priority. All stats which Erie can make great use of. Now when it comes to attack pairs, I highly recommend this thing with Grasp. Grasp while you're in magical form is very powerful because if you're stabilizing, you get the bonus range which makes this a magical range 1 to 3 attack. Plus, with the fact that Grasp allows you to move the opponent, you can easily move the opponent to your maximum range and make sure that you get the bonus power from magical stabilize effect, which is quite powerful as well. Plus, if you push your opponent away and then retreat afterwards, there's a very small chance that they'll ever hit you because you dodged so much. However, if that's not your thing, you can also easily pair this thing with Drive. If you're in cosmic form, this is quite powerful as well, giving you a generally more big range version of Galactic Drive cosmic form. It's quite powerful, it has a lot of decent priority, and has a lot of decent power and hit confirm. Don't underestimate it because it can be quite powerful. Next up is Comet. Comet has power plus 1 and nothing else. However, it's before activating, and on hit effects are quite interesting. Before activating, Erie must advance 3 spaces. Exactly, she can't advance 1 or 2, she has to advance 3. If she switches sides with the opponent, she will miss this attack. And then on hit, she can pull the opponent 1 or 2 spaces. This is a style meant to correct Erie's innate quote-unquote lack of range. She has a lot of medium to small range attacks, but she doesn't have one giant ranged attack that will hit at range 6. This is meant to fix that by giving her effectively range plus 0 to 3 on something. This is quite powerful as long as your opponent is nowhere near the center of the board, because you will often miss if they are. Now, the on-hit effect might not seem that useful, but again, if you think about this in the paradigm of the opponent is at range 6, the on-hit effect can be amazing, pulling them towards melee range where you want them to be because you can threaten them with your cosmic form. Now, when it comes to attack pairs, I highly recommend this thing with her unique base, Starlight. Starlight will work with literally almost all of her forms. The magical gives her extra priority or range, the cosmic gives her extra power, and the Knight gives her extra stun guard, all of which are very powerful things to have on this attack. However, Cosmic has to be the weakest form for this because again, opponents won't be at range 1 when you're using Comet. Most of the time, I highly recommend using this with the magical form if that's what you want. However, aside from this, it also allows you to have a ranged attack. By having a ranged attack, you can easily take advantage of the bonus on hit effect and pull the opponent in. It's very, very good. However, if that's not your thing, you can also easily pair it with Dash. The before activating synergizes with Dash's movement, allowing you to have a near full board range dash most of the time. And the biggest thing about this is the fact that you're not even hitting when you're using a dash, so going over the opponent with Comet is oftentimes not that much of a problem. Next up is Astral. Astral has range plus 0 to 1, power minus 2, and priority minus 1. It has built-in stun guard 3 and 2 awesome effects. Before activating, Erie gains power equal to the amount of damage she's taken this beat, essentially making this a weird version of Cadenza's press attack. However, as an end of beat effect, Erie can also move 1 space, allowing her to get to the positioning she desperately needs, which is around mid to melee range. Now, this attack is quite powerful because it allows Erie to trade with the best of them. If she's slow enough, it's quite powerful to boot. Now, it really depends on how powerful your opponent can hit. If your opponent doesn't really hit that hard, this usually ends up being just a power plus 1 style, which is not bad either. Now, when it comes to attack pairs, I highly recommend this attack with Strike. If you're in magical form and stabilizing, this gives you bonus range, turning the attack into a range 1 to 3 attack with 8 stun guard. If that's not enough to convince you that it's powerful, I don't know what will. However, if that's not your thing, you can also easily pair it with Shot. Shot's extra range synergizes very well with the range of this attack, and its extra stun guard synergizes well with shot stun guard. This will work on almost any form, but I highly recommend pairing it with Knight form. If you transform into the Knight, you get even lower priority, ensuring that you will almost always act second when using this attack pair, which is the case you want because if you go first, this attack pair does nothing. And besides that, you will have range 1 to 5 and stun guard 8, so with that in mind, it's quite powerful and quite potent to boot. And finally, we have Erie's unique base, Starlight. Starlight is range 1 to 2, power 2, and priority 4. This is a very interesting spread because it's basically a bunch of mediocre stats. However, its effects are all really good because they all change how this base's stats are depending on what form Erie is in. If Erie is in cosmic form, she gains power plus 1. If she's in Knight form, she gains power plus 2, stun guard 2, and priority minus 2. And if she's in magical form, she gets priority plus 1. This attack is quite potent and powerful depending on what form you're in. It's able to mutate and adapt to the situation by changing forms. Honestly, personal preference, my favorite form to use this in is Knight because while you're in Knight form, it's a range 1 to 2, power 4, priority 2, but it has like stun guard 5 at least. So it's quite powerful in the Knight form alone. When you pair it up with your styles, it can become even more absurd. Now, when it comes to attack pairs, I highly recommend pairing this thing with Comet. As we've talked about before, Comet plus this synergizes very well because you take advantage of the extra range from Comet and the extra range from Starlight to pull opponents in for the next beat. However, it works very well with Astral as well, especially if you're in the Knight form. Not only will this get a ton of stun guard, around stun guard 8, it has the possibility of dealing a truckload of damage to your opponent if they hit you first. Given that you're transforming into the Knight and have Starlight's minus priority, you'll have priority 0 at this point, which becomes nearly unclashable. Erie's 2 Overdrive finishers are Limit Exceed and Final Galaxy Spear Atomos! Limit Exceed is a low-range, low-power, extremely fast Overdrive finisher that has an amazing on-hit effect. On hit, your opponent is stunned, and for the rest of the game, when Erie transforms, she activates the stabilize effects of all the forms she did not transform into. So if you turn into Magical Girl, you will get the stabilize effects of both Knight and Cosmic form, meaning that Erie essentially has 3 forms active at a time. And this is also reflected in that effect because for the rest of the game, Erie will be considered to be in all 3 forms at the same time for her Galactic and Starlight base. In terms of her Galactic base, this means that if you do anti and transform into one of your forms, you will get that form's transform effect, that form's stabilize effect, as well as 2 instances of the stabilize effects of all the other forms. Meaning that if you're magical, you will get magical transform, magical stabilize, then you will get Knight stabilize twice, then Cosmic stabilize twice. Because when you antied, you will gain the stabilize of the 2 things you are not, and then Galactic's like you transformed, and you will also gain the stabilize effect of whatever form you're in. Note that you're in all 3 forms, so you will gain the stabilize of every single one. On the other hand, if you do not transform, you're considered to be in all 3 forms, meaning that you will get the transform effect of all 3 forms. Meaning that you will have the transform effect of all 3 of the forms while having the stabilize effect of only 1. And for your Starlight, it just stacks all the stats into one attack. So this basically incentivizes you to transform almost every single turn, and that's quite powerful because you get so much stats and so much bonuses from this Overdrive finisher. That is, if you hit with it. Its very small range makes it very hard to make it work, but if you do hit it, you will almost always win the game. Final Galaxy Spear Atomos is a range 3 to 6 Overdrive finisher with 7 power and 2 priority. However, it has a lot of effects that basically mean that it's a souped up version of her Starlight unique base. When you're in magical form, it gives you bonus priority and hit confirm. If you're in night form, it gives you bonus stun guard. And if you're in cosmic form, it allows you to dodge opponents at range 4 or greater. Regardless of what form you're in, this overdrive finisher can be quite powerful, meaning that it's either a relatively fast high damage overdrive finisher that has a lot of range, it could be a very defensive overdrive finisher with some considerable range, or it could just be a really powerful overdrive finisher that deals some decent amount of damage while dodging opponents at bigger range. This overdrive finisher and the previous overdrive finisher aren't really that powerful, mostly because of Erie's unique ability. Erie's unique ability makes it so that she can put random stats on literally every single attack pair she plays, and this also includes the attacks that her overdrive finishers give her, making Limit Exceed and Final Galaxy Spear Atomos much more powerful than they seem because of her extra bonuses from forms. Now when it comes to things like the Force Gauge, the Special Action, and Pulse, Erie benefits not that much from certain things. Overloads are useful, yes they are. However, Erie doesn't really need to use many of them, simply because Erie already has a lot of stats. She has a lot of hit confirm, a lot of damage, a lot of power, a lot of defense, and so on and so forth. However, it can be useful for you to break certain thresholds. Erie has a hard time breaking through Stun Guard 5, and the extra power from the overloads can be very useful in doing that. Just be careful of your opponents anti-ing the Stun Guard 2 to mitigate your extra damage or even the soak. Now, aside from that, Erie doesn't really use the overloads that often, since her unique ability is basically a superior version of that. But if you find the situation to use the bonus stats to your advantage, then by all means do so. Now, when it comes to using the Force Special Action, Erie doesn't really like using Switch. A lot of her stats come from using her styles, and a lot of her styles basically just give her stats, which attributes to her predictability but also attributes to her big strength. So it's very hard for Erie to play blank styles. But if you pair it up with Dash, if you want to use Comet for something else, the extra styles in your hand can be quite powerful because Erie's styles are really good when synergized properly with her forms. And when it comes to Pulse, Erie usually saves up a lot of force because of the fact that she already has an absurd amount of stats. With this in mind, having a lot of force can be very useful in order to use a Pulse. Using a Pulse can be very useful for Erie because she isn't necessarily the most mobile, although she does have some movement options. She doesn't really have big movement that doesn't come at a big cost. So Pulse can be very useful for getting into the range you so desperately need, which is around range 1 to 3. Now let's move on to the part that everybody loves. Erie Advanced Strategies and Combos. Erie Advanced Strategies can be boiled down to around 3 points. Number 1. Stabilizing. Stabilizing as Erie is very important, though anti-ing and changing forms every turn can contribute to your versatility. If you look at the effects very closely, most of the time, the stabilize effects are better than the transform effects. Oftentimes, it's better to get extra range than it is to get extra priority. It's better to have Stun Guard 3 than Stun Guard 3 with minus prio. It's better to get extra prio than it is to get extra power. So on, so forth. These stabilized bonuses are very good. And if you can find it in you to stay on a specific form and abuse the stats it gives you, it will really shoot up your effectiveness. Because you basically trade in your versatility for bigger and better attacks. And if you can press that advantage for even one extra beat, it can break your opponent's back and it can win you the game. That being said, if the situation calls for it, do not be afraid to change forms. Next up is form synergizing. I think you probably already recognized this when I was talking about the attack pairs, but when it comes to Erie, a lot of her attacks can really change what they do depending on what form you're in and whether or not you're even transforming into that form or have stabilized into that form. This means that Erie actually has a lot of versatility in her kit, and every single attack can be different even if you play the same 2 cards for your attack pair. Knowledge of all of these intricate workings and how these effects overlap one another is very important to knowing how Erie works. though I have given you guys some foundation on how to use these synergies to your own advantage, acknowledgement of certain matchups and acknowledgement of certain combinations is very important in playing Erie. So I highly suggest playing more Erie and figuring out and being more aware of these combinations, because whoever knows that a certain combination of a form, stabilize / transform, and style and base can result in the perfect attack pair that will ruin your opponent's day. And finally, we have sit in your armor. Sitting on your armor is a callback to my sitting on the panda in the Tatsumi and Juto video. But what I really mean by this is that the Knight form is arguably her quote-unquote most degenerative form. I say this because the Knight form will make almost any attack you play somewhat work, because of the magical stun guard 3, which is arguably one of the best stats you can have on anything. So, by giving every single one of your attacks magical stun guard 3, you are able to essentially get rid of your opponent's big, fast, stunny attacks and then retaliate with them with usually enough power, giving Erie's big stats. So, as a degenerative strategy, and not necessarily a high level one, if you don't know what to do, sit in your armor. Now let's move on to some Erie combos. Number 1, Astral, Starlight in Knight form. Astral Starlight is a very powerful attack pair. This not only has a lot of range and a lot of stun guard, it also has a low priority value, which means that you will almost always get to make use of Astrals before activating effect. This allows you to win trades with almost anyone and can break your opponent's back if they're not prepared. Next up is Galactic Drive Cosmic form. Galactic Drive Cosmic form at range 1 is quite powerful. It'll deal 5 damage at 7 priority. I need not say more on how amazing this attack can be, especially if your opponent is not prepared with their strike. And finally, we have Magical Grasp, Magical Girl form. Magical Grasp in Magical Girl form is quite powerful because it allows you to take advantage of the extra range, and it allows you to make use of Grasp's extra movement effect to get the extra power +1 from Magical Stabilize effect. This alone can be quite powerful in making sure that your opponent misses you while dealing some decent damage to boot. And that pretty much does it for this episode of Battle Guides featuring Irialandradayamorella. That is always gonna be a mouthful. If you guys like the video, the character, the game, do check the description down below for awesome links to the level 99 game store. I'm sure you'll find something you like. Again, Millennium Blades, BattleCON, and especially their new Exceed fighting game is very interesting if you want to check that out. Now, if you want to talk to me or any of the other BattleCON veterans, do check the description out below for links to our forums and community websites. We're really friendly and will answer any questions you have. If you want to send a message directly to me, of course, you can always email me at my email in the description down below, or you can always write in the comment section and I will reply as soon as possible. Erie is really interesting. I really like her as a character. She's very complicated, which explains why this video is really long. Or maybe not really long, depending on how future Marco edits this video. So, with that in mind, Erie can be very complicated and daunting, especially with all of her possible bonuses from her unique ability. Familiarity and practice will go in a long way in understanding how Erie works. So if you still don't get it after this video, I really suggest you just play her more. So, without much else to say, don't forget your special action, but don't forget the special action, and thank you, World of Indines. Thank you, and good night!